Happy 75th birthday, Adeline. Don't worry, this will be the last time you ever have to count. The words fell from Julian's lips, cold and clinical, slicing through the frigid New Year's Eve air like a scalpel. My husband of 50 years, the man whose shadow had been entwined with mine for half a century, leaned over me. His breath, heavy with the cloying, fermented stench of expensive vintage wine, brushed against my cheek. I lay there, anchored to the bed, as motionless as a piece of discarded antique furniture gathering dust in the corner of my own room. I was a spectator in my own body, watching him through the haze of a forced paralysis. On the nightstand, a small celebratory cake sat under the sickly glow of a single green candle. The flame flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping fingers on the wallpaper. But it wasn't the sight that caught my attention. It was the scent. Decades spent in the high-pressure corridors of the emergency room had sharpened my senses into a biological radar. Beneath the sugary mask of vanilla frosting, my olfactory memory triggered a silent alarm, the faint, metallic bitterness of crushed almonds. Cyanide. Julian wasn't looking for a spectacle. He was a man of precision. He wanted a gradual decline, a subtle fading of the heart muscle, so that the official report would read, "Natural causes, the expected end for a weary woman of 75. A bitter irony curled in my chest. For 50 years, these nursing hands had mended his wounds, ironed his white coats, and nurtured his ambitions. Now, he was using his refined medical knowledge to usher me into the earth. His long-term kindness had been nothing more than a slow-acting toxin, and I had swallowed it daily with a smile.
The door creaked open, and a flash of crimson burned my retinas. Sienna stepped in. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs as I saw what she was wearing. The red silk dress. It was the last gift my late son had painstakingly chosen for me before the accident took him 2 years ago. The fabric shimmered under the dim light, a vibrant mockery of my mourning. My daughter-in-law glided across the room with a predatory grace, eventually sinking onto Julian's lap at the foot of my bed. They began to exchange brazen, sickening kisses, their weight pressing down on my numb, unresponsive legs. Sienna giggled, her voice thin and laced with venom. "Old man, how much longer until she's finally gone? I'm exhausted from playing the devoted daughter-in-law. I'm sick of the smell of antiseptics and old age." Julian ran his fingers through her hair, his eyes reflecting a raw, naked greed for the Miller medical empire he was about to monopolize. "Patience, my love. Tonight, she will succumb to the crushing weight of depression over our dear son's death. A cocktail of sedatives mixed with the biting frost of the balcony. No one questions the fragility of a broken old woman. They had no idea. Underneath the facade of a lifeless corpse, a chemical storm was brewing. Adrenaline, the body's primal scream for survival, was beginning to flood my veins. A sharp, stinging spark of electricity, agonizing yet beautiful, flickered at the tip of my paralyzed toe. It was a violent surge of life, the kind of autonomic reflex that occurs only when a human soul is pushed to the absolute precipice. They clicked off the lights, the darkness swallowing the room. I heard the definitive clack of the door being locked from the outside. They were heading downstairs to toast to a new year, leaving me with a 15-minute countdown to extinction. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. I was not just a dying old woman. I am Adeline Miller, chief nurse of the Miller Institute. And this New Year's Eve, I was about to perform the most critical emergency procedure of my career, the resuscitation of my own life and honor, with hands that were ready to bleed for justice.
Julian and Sienna were certain I had drifted into the abyssal depths of a drug-induced coma, courtesy of the heavy sedative he had administered earlier that evening. What they failed to grasp, what Julian's arrogant medical mind overlooked, was the biological law of habituation. Every milliliter of toxin he had slipped into my system over the past 2 years had unwittingly served as a grueling apprenticeship for my cells. My body had forged a strange, defiant resistance. I lay there, my breathing maintained at the shallow, rhythmic cadence of a dying woman, yet every one of my senses was stretched taut, like a piano wire vibrating at the slightest touch. The room was a cavern of shadows, save for the pale, sickly luminescence of streetlights bleeding through the cracks in the window shutters. Sienna moved first. I felt the mattress groan and dip under her weight near my feet, a tangible intrusion. Her presence arrived before her touch, a suffocating cloud of expensive, musky perfume that clashed violently with the lingering scent of antiseptic. Then came the rustle of Julian's suit, the sliding of silk against silk, and a muffled, brazen chuckle that desecrated a space meant for the dignity of a wife and mother. He pulled her into an embrace. Right there, on the very bed where I had been a prisoner to paralysis for 2 years, they began their grotesque intimacy. The sound of their quickening breath mingled with the distant, festive pops of New Year's fireworks echoing from the city streets. Sienna's voice arrived as a soft, saccharine purr. Yet it carried the edge of a jagged blade. "Darling, are you absolutely sure the old hag can't hear us? Look at her. She looks like a dried-out husk. It's haunting." Julian gave a low, throaty laugh. I could feel his gaze, cold and calculating, boring into my motionless face, searching for a flicker of consciousness that wasn't there. "Don't fret, my love." That dose was enough to fell an elephant. Tonight, as the city celebrates a new beginning, she will finally join her precious son. The stage is set. A broken mother, consumed by grief, accidentally rolls her wheelchair onto the balcony in the dead of winter. Her heart stops from the cold. A perfect script. Not a single puncture in the plot. Inside my chest, a physiological tempest was brewing. My heart began to gallop. A frantic thumping so violent I feared the cardiac monitor beside the bed would betray me with a piercing alarm. If that machine emitted a single beep now, the curtain would fall on my life. Drawing upon decades of clinical discipline, I forced my mind to disconnect from the visceral agony of betrayal. I focused entirely on my diaphragm. Inhale, slow, steady. Hold the air in the abdominal cavity. Exhale like a ghost of a breeze. I practiced a form of self-hypnosis, convincing my nervous system that I was nothing more than a piece of timber, unfeeling, inanimate, void of pain. Slowly, the digital readout on the monitor stabilized, its rhythmic tethering to my life masking the explosion of rage roaring beneath my ribs. Betrayal is not merely a knife in the back. It is the sensation of being hollowed out by the very people you once shielded. I remembered the sleepless nights spent nursing Julian through his fevers, and the way I had mentored Sienna when she first arrived as a naive daughter-in-law. All those sacrifices had been seasoned and served as a feast for their greed. Suddenly,
A sharp thud broke the silence. Sienna had pulled a thick file from her bag and tossed it onto the mahogany nightstand. "And Mark's accident?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you certain the police won't find anything? I still see his face in my dreams, that look he gave us when he caught us at the hotel that night." Julian froze. His voice shifted, losing its warmth, replaced by a chilling, surgical detachment. "I told you never to speak of it again. I handled the brake lines myself. The boy died because he was stubborn. He dared to threaten his own father with exposure. He chose death over silence. That was his error, not ours." Each word was a red-hot needle driven into my eardrums. My son, my Mark, didn't die in a tragic mishap. He was executed by his own father for the crime of being honorable. The emotional trauma surpassed any physical pain I had ever endured. But in that moment of total devastation, something miraculous happened. A surge of bioelectricity, a raw, unadulterated jolt of adrenaline shot down my spinal column and flickered into my legs. It was the primal survival instinct of a mother who finally knew the truth. Julian stood up, his footsteps echoing with finality as he walked toward the medicine cabinet. He didn't approach me with a syringe this time. Instead, he moved toward the IV bag, hanging beside my bed, the clear plastic lifeline that trickled into my vein. He began to inject a colorless liquid into the port. "High-dose insulin," he murmured, his voice a haunting lullaby. "It will plummet your blood sugar into the abyss. You'll simply slip away into a dream, Adeline. No pain, no evidence." I watched. Through the slit of my eyelids, the first treacherous drop of the concentrated hormone fall into the drip chamber. It was a 15-minute journey to brain death. Julian and Sienna lingered for a moment before retreating toward the door, casually locking the balcony latch, as if they were merely closing a chapter. They believed I was a pawn they had finally checkmated. In the suffocating silence of the darkened room, I moved my hand. It was a microscopic tremor, agonizingly slow, but my fingers brushed against the underside of the duvet until they found it. The sharp, jagged hair clip Sienna had carelessly dropped earlier. This was my only window. I needed a stimulus, a pain so sharp and profound it would override the impending hypoglycemic shock and force my system to dump every reserve of glucose and adrenaline into my bloodstream. I would not let the cold or the insulin take me. I would live to make them pay for every drop of my son's blood.
The heavy thud of the door echoed through the room like a gavel, sealing me into a vault of oppressive silence. All that remained was the rhythmic, indifferent tick-tock of the wall clock and the hypnotic, crystalline plink of the IV bag dripping steadily. Julian and Sienna had descended the stairs, their footsteps fading into the muffled hum of the mansion. They moved with the casual arrogance of architects who had just laid the final stone of a tomb. They believed they were leaving a corpse in waiting, but they had overlooked one variable: the transformative power of a mother's fury. Julian's cold admission regarding Mark's accident had surged through me like a defibrillator's jolt. Mark, my boy, the child who grew up wrapped in my hopes and sheltered by my love, the one who would always tenderly remind me to take my vitamins, had not been taken by fate. He had been harvested by the man he called father. Julian hadn't just severed the brake lines. He had shredded the very fabric of my soul. A furnace of white-hot rage ignited in my chest, threatening to shatter my ribs. And then it happened. A faint electric tingle sharp as 1,000 needles began to dance along my lower back, cascading down into the tip of my left big toe. It was a sensation I hadn't felt in 2 agonizing years. My instincts as a veteran ER nurse screamed the diagnosis: an extreme physiological surge. When a human being is pushed to the ultimate precipice of life and death, the massive dump of adrenaline can occasionally bypass damaged neural pathways or override chemically induced blockades. Julian had imprisoned me in a pharmacological cage for 24 months, but he had failed to account for the fact that pure, unadulterated hatred can dissolve even the most potent sedatives. Time was a shrinking resource. The insulin Julian had injected was already beginning its silent, metabolic assault. In minutes, it would begin to strip the glucose from my blood, starving my brain and plunging me into a hypoglycemic coma from which there would be no return. I had to act while my consciousness still flickered. I forced my fingers to twitch. They felt heavy, like lead pipes submerged in thick oil. Inch by excruciating inch, my right hand crawled across the duvet, searching for the jagged hair clip Sienna had discarded. My skin felt hypersensitive, every fiber of the linen blanket feeling like coarse sandpaper against my dulled nerves. Finally, my fingertips brushed the cold, sharp steel of the clip. With a monumental effort that left me gasping, I curled my body slightly, a movement that felt like breaking rusted iron. I gripped the hair clip and drove its point with everything I had into the Yongquan point, the center of the sole of my foot. A jagged bolt of lightning-white pain ripped through my nervous system, screaming up to my brain. I bit my lip so hard I tasted the metallic tang of blood, stifling a shriek that would have brought them running. But I welcomed the agony. I needed it. I needed the sympathetic nervous system to ignite, forcing my liver to dump its last reserves of glycogen into my bloodstream to counteract the insulin's deadly tide. The greatest tragedy in life isn't losing a loved one. It's the realization that you have shared your bed with a demon for half a century. I had loved a phantom, nurtured a home that was, in reality, a slaughterhouse designed by Julian's hand. Betrayal is a virus for which there is no vaccine. It erodes the humanity within us long before the flesh gives way. As I struggled against the encroaching darkness, the door creaked. Julian was back. I froze, instantly reverting to the mask of a corpse. He didn't look at my face. He was a man obsessed with the mechanics of the kill. He approached the IV stand, his eyes fixed on the fluid. He produced a second syringe. This time, he didn't inject me directly. He moved with a chilling, surgical deliberation, emptying the contents into the flowing drip bag. "A little something extra for you, Adeline," he whispered. A twisted, distorted smile visible in the dim amber glow of the night lamp. "To ensure that tomorrow morning, when they find you out on that balcony, everything will be perfectly clean." I remained motionless. My eyelids parted just a fraction of a millimeter. I watched his back as he turned to leave. Julian didn't believe in luck. He believed in the absolute precision of dosages and flow rates. But he had forgotten one fundamental truth. I was a chief nurse long before I was his invalid. I knew his pharmacopoeia better than he did. He had combined high-dose insulin with the cyanide already leaching from the cake, a double tap designed to fail-safe the cessation of both heart and brain. But Julian's narcissism had left a flaw. He was so convinced of my total paralysis that he didn't bother to lock the flow regulator after his second injection. The moment the door latched, I summoned every ounce of strength left in my right hand. I reached up, my arm trembling violently, and gripped the IV tubing. With a guttural, silent snarl, I yanked. The plastic regulator slipped, the wheel spinning under my thumb. I couldn't pull the needle out entirely, that would leave a telltale spray of blood, but I managed to choke the flow to a microscopic crawl. The death fluid was no longer a torrent. It was a mere whisper. The narrative of my life had now become a high-stakes race against the Reaper. I forced myself upright. My legs felt like jelly, shaking uncontrollably. But for the first time in years, they held weight. I swung them over the side of the bed. The cold from the marble floor surged up through my feet, a freezing shock that helped sharpen my blurred vision. I had to get out of this room. I had to move before Julian returned for the final stroll that would end on the balcony. Every muscle fiber screamed in protest, but the image of Mark's face gave me a skeletal strength. I wasn't just walking. I was rising from the grave. Just as my clinical intuition predicted, in less than 10 minutes, the rhythmic thud of footsteps returned to the hallway. The heavy, purposeful gait of two predators approaching their prey. I moved with a phantom speed, sliding back into the hollow of the mattress and readjusting the IV line to its original deceptive position. I surrendered my features to the slack. Vacant mask of a patient slipping into the final, irreversible stages of metabolic collapse. Sienna breached the threshold first. She was a vision in stolen silk, my son's final gift to me, clinging to her curves like a scarlet insult. A crystal flute of champagne bubbled in her hand, a golden, effervescent celebration of my demise. Her face was flushed with the sickly glow of a woman who believed this New Year's Eve was the dawn of her empire. "Time for your final stroll, darling," she hissed, her voice a saccharine drip of pure, morbid exhilaration. "It's a bitter night, Adeline. Imagine the tragedy. A paralyzed woman, rolling herself onto the balcony in a fit of grief, only to fall asleep forever in the heart of a blizzard. It's a story that will move the city to tears." Julian remained a silent shadow. He approached the bed with the detached efficiency of a pathologist. He didn't bother to check my carotid pulse or the dilation of my pupils. His narcissism was his blind spot. He was so convinced by the mathematical certainty of his dosages that he no longer saw the woman beneath the skin. He hoisted me up, his grip as clinical and unyielding as a set of surgical forceps. Being held by the man I had loved for half a century no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt like being touched by a shroud. He deposited me into the wheelchair. The leather was ice cold, biting through my thin hospital gown. As he pushed me toward the balcony, the transition was violent. The sliding glass door groaned open, and the midnight air hit me like a physical blow, a wall of frost that sucked the oxygen from my lungs. The door hissed shut behind me, the lock clicking with a definitive, metallic finality. He drew the sheer curtains, severing my last tether to the warmth of the room. Through the translucent veil of the fabric, I watched them shadows in a golden cage, celebrating my execution. But in that darkness, a microscopic detail caught my eye through a sliver in the drapes. While Sienna was turned away, her eyes fixed on the distant fireworks blooming like flowers of fire over the city, Julian reached into his breast pocket. He produced a small glassine envelope containing a fine, white crystalline powder. With the steady hand of a master pharmacist, he emptied the entire contents into Sienna's glass. A gentle swirl of the crystal, a deceptive smile, and he handed the lethal cocktail back to his accomplice. My heart hammered against my sternum, a frantic, irregular beat. Betrayal, it seemed, was an infinite loop, a serpent devouring its own tail. The man who had liquidated his wife and son saw no reason to share the spoils with a mere mistress. He wanted a clean slate. By dawn, the authorities would find a suicide in the snow and a daughter-in-law dead of a sudden cardiac arrest or an accidental overdose. He would be the ultimate victim, a man who lost his entire world in a single tragic night, leaving him the sole grieving proprietor of the Miller fortune. In the harsh reality of trauma, extreme cold can be a strange ally. The biting frost settling on my shoulders triggered a rapid peripheral vasoconstriction, the body's primal way of shunting blood to the core. It was slowing the absorption of the residual toxins in my system, buying me precious seconds of clarity. Once again, I reached down, my fingers numb and clumsy, and drove the hair clip into the Yongquan point at the center of my foot. The jagged spear of pain shattered the encroaching fog of hypoglycemia. I needed that agony. I needed the neurochemical jolt to keep my consciousness from drifting into the white abyss. Through the glass, I saw Sienna raise the poisoned glass to her lips. She laughed, her eyes wide with shimmering illusions of a future built on blood, unaware that the scythe was already at her throat. Julian stood opposite her, sipping his own untainted wine, his eyes as vacant and frozen as the landscape behind me. I could no longer afford to be a spectator. The massive surge of adrenaline, fueled by the sight of Julian's double cross, gave my atrophied muscles a borrowed, skeletal strength. I rolled myself out of the chair, my body hitting the frozen stone of the balcony floor with a dull, heavy thud. I began to crawl. I wasn't an elderly woman of 75 anymore. I was a surgeon of my own destiny. Using the remaining strength in my nursing hands, I dragged myself toward the window of the old study. The one latch I knew was faulty, the one vulnerability in Julian's fortress. A human being only discovers the true extent of their power when the reaper's breath is colder than the winter wind. I was no longer a victim. I was a predator in the dark, performing the most vital operation of my life, the excision of the malignancy that had consumed my family. The New Year's Eve blizzard howled through the crevices of the balcony door, each gust of frozen air slicing into my lungs like thin, serrated blades. Julian had double-locked the glass door behind him, leaving me solitary and exposed in the pitch-black void of the suburbs. He retreated into the sanctuary of the house, where the warm amber glow of chandeliers and the strains of aristocratic classical music hummed with pretension. He was utterly convinced that I, his bedridden, elderly wife, was nothing more than a discarded vessel, waiting to be encased in ice. Through the balcony glass, blurred by the condensation of my own shallow breath, I witnessed the final act of a most monstrous play. Julian and Sienna raised their champagne flutes, their eyes locking in a triumph of greed. A victor's smile bloomed on the young daughter-in-law's face. But the moment she drained the glass, the one Julian had spiked with that white powder, the world tilted into a horror she never anticipated. Sienna froze mid-laugh. The crystal flute slipped from her fingers, shattering into 1,000 diamonds against the crimson rug. Her hands flew to her throat, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed, and her complexion shifted violently from a wine-flushed pink to a ghastly, bruised purple. She clawed at the air, her mouth agape in a silent scream, but her ribcage remained eerily, terrifyingly still. The muscles in her neck corded and spasmed in a frantic, rhythmic dance, yet she could produce no sound but a faint, wet wheeze. Watching her writhe on the floor, my instincts as a chief nurse overrode my own agony. I recognized the toxin immediately. A high-grade neuromuscular blocking agent, the kind reserved for complex surgeries to induce total paralysis. It had seized her entire muscular system, including the diaphragm, the very engine of breath. Julian wanted her to die of asphyxiation while her mind remained perfectly, cruelly conscious of the pain. He was purging his accomplice to stand alone atop the ruins of the Miller Empire. Betrayal is a closed loop. A man who could cold-bloodedly cut his son's brake lines and poison his wife for 2 years would never stop until he was the last soul standing on a hill of bones. Julian stood over her, casually finishing his own drink, his gaze as detached as a gardener watching a weed wither. There was no panic, no remorse, only the chilling patience of a predator. In that moment, a staggering realization shattered the fog of my impending hypoglycemic shock. Fueled by a volcanic rage, I gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. A surge of white-hot electric energy roared down my spine and into the legs that had been captive for years. My mind screamed in disbelief. I was not permanently paralyzed. The truth crystallized with terrifying clarity. Julian had utilized his pharmaceutical expertise to administer daily injections of motor nerve inhibitors, masking them as neurological supplements. He had incarcerated me within the cage of my own flesh to facilitate his coup. Tonight, blinded by his overconfidence in the lethal insulin dose and the freezing balcony, he had skipped the scheduled inhibitor. The biting cold and the peak of my adrenaline had triggered a violent biochemical rebellion, temporarily overriding the chemical chains. I could not sit here and wait for the frost to claim me. I had to act before Julian returned, to collect my corpse. With the residual strength of a woman who had spent a lifetime in clinical labor, I leaned forward and rolled myself out of the chair. My emaciated frame hit the frozen balcony tiles with a bone-jarring thud, the pain radiating through my joints, but my will to survive drowned it out. I began to crawl across the snow-covered floor. Every centimeter was a life-or-death struggle. My hands bled as I clawed at the sharp stone edges, but I did not stop. I dragged my weight toward the window of my old study. The one latch I knew I could manipulate, with the jagged hair clip I still clutched like a holy relic. Inside, beneath the living room table, Sienna had stopped moving. Julian began to meticulously clean up the shattered glass, his movements slow and methodical, like a devoted butler. He had no inkling that just inches away, separated by a thin pane of glass, the wife he had discarded was rising from the dead with the ferocity of a mother who had lost everything. We are taught in medicine that the human body can achieve the impossible when cornered by death. Tonight, I, Adeline Miller, was the living proof. I reached the study window, my hands trembling as I slid the hair clip into the crevice. My time was hemorrhaging. The insulin was beginning to make the world spin in dizzying, dark circles. But I swore to the heavens I would not die until I saw Julian dragged into the light. The frost from the balcony tiles seeped through my thin hospital gown. turning my flesh into a canvas of shivers with every shallow, ragged breath. Yet, this biting cold was my only ally. In the brutal logic of survival, hypothermia slows the metabolic rate, a physiological anchor that bought me precious minutes before Julian's high-dose insulin could fully ravage my brain. My vision began to fray at the edges. The distant New Year's fireworks dissolved into menacing streaks of light, dancing like malevolent spirits in the dark. I was teetering on the precipice of a severe hypoglycemic shock. If I succumbed now, the blizzard would become a white shroud, concealing Julian's atrocities forever. I cannot fall. I must live to bear witness for Mark. Summoning the dregs of my strength, I clawed at the narrow crevices between the stone tiles with my emaciated fingers. My fingertips tore, leaving dark, frozen smears on the white frost. The sharp, pulsating stabs of pain were welcome. I used them as anchors to keep my consciousness from dissolving into a lethal sleep. I dragged my weight centimeter by agonizing centimeter, my heavy body trailing across the balcony like a wounded animal seeking its burrow. Through the glass of the living room, Julian's silhouette appeared blurred but abhorrent. He was stooped over Sienna's lifeless form, his movements meticulous and horrifyingly calm. He began using a white cloth to dab away the spilled wine from the hardwood floor, his motions rhythmic and slow, as if performing a sacred ritual. He had no inkling that just a pane of glass and a sheer curtain away, the wife he had discarded as a vegetable was orchestrating an impossible escape. I finally reached the sill of my old study window. This had been my private sanctuary during my tenure as chief nurse at the Miller Institute. I knew the secret of this frame. The lock was archaic and faulty, susceptible to a precise strike against the internal steel latch. With trembling hands, I produced Sienna's jagged hair clip, the relic of her brazen infidelity, and slid it into the microscopic gap of the window frame. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead despite the sub-zero air. Every second that ticked by saw my blood glucose levels plummet further. My heart began to gallop, a classic sympathetic nervous system response to a critical energy deficit. I gritted my teeth, channeling the final embers of my strength into my wrist, and pried. A dry, metallic crack echoed a sound that, to my ears, was as thunderous as a cathedral bell. The window budged, just enough for me to slip inside. I tumbled onto the study floor. The scent of old parchment and the residual warmth from the wall heater hit me with such force I nearly lost consciousness. I lay there, gasping, my chest heaving like a rusted set of bellows. The sudden shift in temperature triggered peripheral vasodilation, causing my blood pressure to dip even further. I was hemorrhaging time. Without intervention, a deep coma would claim me within 5 to 10 minutes. I crawled toward the heavy oak desk. Hidden beneath the secret drawer where I used to keep personal medical supplies during my active years was my only hope. My hand fumbled in the dark, brushing against cold files and an old stethoscope, until my fingers closed around a small plastic case. Inside was an emergency epinephrine auto-injector. I squinted at the label in the dim light. It had expired 6 months ago. In clinical practice, expired medication often suffers from reduced potency or degraded stabilizers. But in this room, it was the only bridge between life and death. Epinephrine doesn't just jumpstart the heart. It stimulates the liver to convert stored glycogen into glucose, the most potent counterstrike against the hypoglycemia ravaging my system. Without hesitation, I jammed the needle through my gown and into my left vastus lateralis muscle. A searing heat radiated instantly. I depressed the plunger, forcing the life-saving fluid into my body. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The localized sting in my thigh was suddenly eclipsed by a violent surge of energy. My heart thrashed against my ribs like a high-performance engine suddenly fed with racing fuel. The dark spots in my vision evaporated. My mind snapped into a sharp, agonizing focus. Sweat poured from me, but the lethargy was gone. This clarity was painful, but it was the lucidity of a soldier returning from the brink. We only truly realize the extraordinary limits of our frame when death is breathing down our necks. I slumped against the desk, panting to regulate my racing pulse. My bloodied hand brushed against a cold metal object mounted underneath the mahogany surface. A jolt of electricity ran down my spine as I realized what it was. The old radio transceiver, hardwired directly into the Miller Hospital's emergency PA system. It was an executive failsafe designed for instant communication during a mass casualty event, bypassing the central switchboard. I looked at the radio, then at the study door, standing slightly ajar. On the other side of that wall, Julian was likely preparing for the final act of his play, discovering my body and summoning the police with the rehearsed grief of a tragic widower. The brilliant, murderous doctor always prided himself on his precision. He calculated every dose, every movement, every scenario. But he had forgotten a fundamental tenet of medicine. The human body is not a soulless machine, and the will of a mother who has lost her son can generate chemical reactions that no laboratory can predict. I reached for the transceiver. A faint, low-frequency hiss emerged as I flipped the toggle. In the next room, I could hear Julian muttering to himself, perhaps rehearsing his lies before a mirror. He had no idea that this quiet study was about to become a courtroom without a jury, where he would sign his own death warrant with his own tongue. I pressed my ear to the door, listening to the predatory click of Julian's heels as he approached. The blood in my veins wasn't just pumping now. It was boiling not from the drug, but from a vengeance that was finally taking shape in the shadows. Julian's footsteps thudded rhythmically against the oak floor, each strike a hammer blow against my frayed nerves. I pressed my body into the ink-black shadows beneath the study desk, my bloodied hands white-knuckled around the ancient transceiver. Sweat, slick and cold, made the textured plastic of the device feel like a slippery eel in my grip. I could sense his presence through the paper-thin barrier of the wall. The cloying scent of premium cigars and the yeasty tang of champagne began to seep through the ajar door. Julian paused in the center of the living room. He was in no hurry. With the soul of a surgeon who lived to control every variable, he was savoring the silence, a silence he believed marked the dawn of his absolute reign. I held my breath, my thumb hovering over the broadcast button. I knew that at the Miller Institute, over a mile away, the emergency PA system in the ER station was active. My former colleagues, the young nurses I had mentored, were likely staring in stunned silence at the strange signal bleeding through the New Year's Eve quiet. I pressed the button. A microscopic click echoed in the darkness. From this moment on, the room was no longer a private sanctuary. It was an open auditorium for the naked, hideous truth. Julian began to speak. His voice had shed its practiced warmth, the benevolent healer mask discarded. In its place was a dry, arrogant rasp that chilled the marrow He was talking to himself or perhaps to the cooling spirit of Sienna sprawled on the floor. Finally. Clean, he murmured, the leather of his soles creaking as he began to pace. A bit earlier than planned, but your death is the perfect final piece, Sienna. A tragic young lover, unable to bear the psychological weight of her husband's accident, chooses to end her life alongside the frail Adeline. How the police will pity me. A widower who lost his entire world in a single night. He let out a thin, sibilant laugh. Mark, my boy, you should have been smarter. You should have never crawled under my car to check that brake line. You know, that cut was the most precise incision I've ever made in my career. But you forgot that in this world, the one who holds the power over life and death is the one who decides the truth. Every word he uttered vibrated through the hospital speakers miles away. I could almost see the bloodless faces of the night shift staff. My blood felt like it was boiling in my veins. The epinephrine was slamming my heart against my ribs so hard it was physically painful, but the raw fury kept me from collapsing. Julian walked toward the balcony, sliding the glass door open. The blizzard roared back into the room. He stood there, staring at the empty wheelchair he believed had been claimed by the storm. Adeline, for 50 years you were a shadow too large to escape. Your kindness, your devotion, it made me feel small. I injected you with those motor nerve inhibitors every single day just to keep you silent, to make you watch me seize this hospital without being able to whisper a single word of protest. And tonight, that insulin will finish the job. A mercy for both of us. At that exact moment, from the base of the villa's driveway, the wail of police sirens and the staccato rhythm of ambulance lights tore through the stillness. Red and blue flashes swept across the study window, illuminating Julian's silhouette on the balcony like a trapped ghost. Julian froze. His entire frame went rigid. He couldn't comprehend why they were here. He hadn't even picked up the phone to report the accident yet. Panic, raw and jagged, began to colonize his features. Through the crack in the door, I saw the left side of his face suddenly twitch violently. His left eyelid drooped. The corner of his mouth sagged into a grotesque, lopsided sneer. He tried to step back into the room, but his left leg dragged heavily against the hardwood. An intracerebral hemorrhage. A massive stroke. The hyper-arousal of his victory, combined with the alcohol in his blood, and the sudden, extreme psychological stress of being caught, had sent his blood pressure skyrocketing past the breaking point of his cerebral capillaries. His body was betraying him at the very moment he thought he had won. He lurched, his hand clawing at the mahogany table, but everything was sliding out of his reach. I crawled out from under the desk, using a swivel chair to hoist myself up. The dizzying spell of hypoglycemia lingered, but the adrenaline held me upright with a skeletal strength. Julian turned, his eyes bulging as he saw me standing there in the gloom. My silver hair disheveled, my eyes burning with a vengeful fire. He stammered, his voice now nothing more than a wet, meaningless gurgle as his tongue succumbed to hemiparalysis. You, how? He couldn't believe his eyes. To him, a woman subjected to 2 years of nerve inhibitors and a lethal dose of insulin should be a corpse. He thought he was looking at a specter rising from the blizzard. In a fit of stroke-induced delirium and primal terror, Julian snatched a surgical scalpel from a tray near the wine decanter. He didn't think of fleeing. He thought only of silencing the final obstacle before his world collapsed. He dragged his leaden leg toward me, the blade trembling in his hand. Every step was a violent struggle against a nervous system that was shattering from within. I didn't flinch. I looked directly into his bloodshot, clouded eyes, my hand tightening around the transceiver that was still broadcasting. "Julian," I said, my voice as cold and heavy as a tombstone. "It's over. The whole world heard your confession. Don't fight it. Your brain can't survive another second of this agitation." He let out an unintelligible roar and threw his remaining strength into a desperate lunge. But his paralyzed foot caught the edge of the rug. He tumbled forward toward the wide-open balcony door, his torso draped over the railing, suspended over the abyss where the blizzard waited to swallow the guilty. I walked toward him, looking down at the man who was once my husband, now dangling between life and death. Justice required no courtroom tonight. It was unfolding right here, amid the blood, the snow, and the wreckage of a lie. Julian lay half kneeling, half sprawled against the threshold of the balcony door. His massive, imposing frame convulsed in rhythmic tremors as the capillaries in his brain, once the seat of his cold, calculating genius, succumbed to the mounting pressure and burst like overfilled dams. The surgical scalpel, polished to a mirror sheen, slipped from his nerveless fingers and struck the marble floor with a dry, metallic clang. He clawed at the frozen iron railing, desperate to anchor his collapsing world. But the left side of his body had already defected. His paralyzed leg dragged uselessly across the tiles, while his left arm dangled like a frayed, severed rope. I stood barely 3 feet from him. It was a distance intimate enough to witness the microscopic crimson webs fracturing within his bloodshot, clouded eyes. His head tilted at a grotesque angle. A thick, viscous rope of saliva began to leak from the lopsided corner of his mouth. This was the ultimate dividend of his arrogance. When a doctor usurps the power of the divine to decide who lives and who dies, his own biology eventually signs the warrant. He was disintegrating from the inside out at the exact moment he believed he had reached the summit of his coup. The blizzard roared through the open door, whipping my silver hair and tugging at the thin fabric of my hospital gown. In his stroke-induced delirium, Julian looked at me with a gaze that was a jagged cocktail of primal terror and wordless supplication. He tried to speak, but his tongue was a leaden weight, producing only a wet, guttural rattle from his constricted esophagus. He was drifting into the gray twilight of unconsciousness, his grip on the railing loosening by the second. A mere nudge, even a moment of indifferent stillness, would allow gravity to drag him down to the frozen courtyard 2 stories below. Within my mind, a violent storm of its own was raging. The image of Mark, my only son, lying broken beneath the chassis of his car, his life bled out through severed brake lines, flashed before my eyes with searing clarity. That agony was a furnace, threatening to incinerate my clinical restraint. For 2 years, this man had treated me like a piece of discarded furniture, utilizing his pharmaceutical knowledge to lock my mind inside a paralyzed cage so he could plunder the hospital my father and I had built with our own sweat. A simple push now would be a sweet, poetic justice, a final resolution to years of suppressed screams. But as I stepped toward him, my hands began to tremble. It wasn't fear. It was a reflex etched into my very marrow through 50 years of labor. These fingers had performed tens of thousands of emergency procedures. They had sutured 1,000 wounds and held the line for hearts teetering on the edge of the abyss. I was a chief nurse. I had sworn an oath under the caduceus to protect life until the final spark flickered out. Regardless of the soul that carried it, Julian's betrayal had transformed him into a demon. But if I were to kill him now, what would remain of me? If I used my medical knowledge to terminate a life rather than sustain it, then my half-century of service would be reduced to a pile of meaningless ash. I refused to defeat him by becoming him. I lunged forward, not to push, but to seize the lapels of his white lab coat. Julian's dead weight was massive compared to my emaciated frame, and for a terrifying second, he nearly dragged us both over the precipice. I gritted my teeth, planting my feet still vibrating from the inhibitors firmly against the stone. Reaching for the thick, braided nylon cord used to tie back the heavy balcony awnings, I began to work. My movements were fluid, professional, and swift, as if I were securing a combative patient in an overcrowded ER. I looped the cord beneath his armpits and across his broad chest. I executed high-tension maritime hitches, the kind we use to restrain deliriant patients on their beds, anchoring him securely to the unyielding iron railing. Every wrap of the rope wasn't an act of mercy to save him from death. It was an act of cold iron will to ensure he lived. I wanted him alive to face the tribunal he so desperately feared. I wanted him to exist in a vegetative state conscious within his own helplessness, to taste the flavor of the somatic prison he had forced me to inhabit for 700 days. That was the only punishment that mattered. "You won't die that easily, Julian." I rasped into his ear, my breath a hot mist in the freezing air. "I won't let you take the truth to a quiet grave. You will live to watch the empire of lies you built collapse into the dirt." Julian let out a pathetic moan, a hollow sound from the depths of his throat as the ropes tightened. The intracranial pressure was peaking. He began to projectile vomit, a clinical indicator of severe brainstem irritation. With the practiced reflex of a professional, I sharply turned his head to the side to prevent aspiration. It was a gesture of care that was utterly devoid of affection, the coldest, most clinical service a nurse could ever provide a patient. The screech of tires and the slamming of ambulance doors erupted in the courtyard below. The harsh beams of police flashlights swept upward, illuminating the macabre tableau on the balcony. A skeletal old woman in a nightgown, tying a massive, broken man to the railing in the middle of a blizzard. "Freeze! Police!" The shout echoed from the stairwell. I tied the final knot and stood tall. My body was a map of agony. The soles of my feet felt like they were resting on beds of hot needles, and the hypoglycemia was finally pulling the veil of darkness over my eyes. Yet I stood, leaning against the cold stone, as the muzzles of guns and the white coats of paramedics flooded the room. Julian looked like a captured beast, his face lopsided, his body suspended by ropes, his mouth stained with bile. He watched his former colleagues enter, their eyes filled with a visceral loathing as their own handheld radios continued to blare his recorded confession. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't the radiator. It was the profound serenity of a promise kept. I hadn't become a murderer. I had resuscitated a criminal so that he could endure the slow, grinding gears of justice. My hand found the transceiver on the floor. I clicked the toggle to off, silencing the broadcast from hell. "I am Adeline Miller," I said to the officer approaching me, my voice thin but as sharp as a lancet. "This man has just attempted a double homicide, and I am the last witness left alive." As the final word left my lips, the darkness claimed me. I collapsed onto the floor, but in the moment my consciousness flickered out, I knew that on this New Year's Eve, I had finally won. The New Year's Eve night, which should have been a symphony of laughter and pyrotechnics, lay shattered inside the Miller estate, a wasteland of hollowed souls. I drifted back to consciousness as the biting frost of the balcony tiles began to recede, replaced by the stifling heat of emergency thermal blankets and the abrasive white glare of high-intensity tactical flashlights. My ears rang with a dissonant chorus, the rhythmic thud of combat boots, the staccato crackle of police radios, and the persistent, low-frequency hiss of the transceiver still lying near the iron railing. The first responders and forensic teams breached the living room like an unstoppable tide. Their initial focus wasn't on me, but on Sienna. She lay contorted on the floor. Her scarlet silk dress, once a symbol of her stolen triumph, now wrinkled and stained, looking like a fresh wound against the hardwood. A paramedic dropped to his knees beside her, his fingers jabbing urgently into the carotid artery beneath her jaw. He shook his head, his face hardening as he noted her fixed, dilated pupils and the deep cyanosis of her lips. The neuromuscular blocker Julian had chosen had performed its task with clinical cruelty. It had paralyzed every voluntary motion, leaving her mind terrifyingly alert until the final moment when her diaphragm failed and her lungs went still. "First victim is asystolic. No pulse," the shout echoed, immediately drowned out by the chaotic scramble on the balcony. Every gun, muzzle, and flashlight beam now converged on Julian. He remained suspended, a macabre marionette held upright by my intricate, high-tension knots. The face of the most powerful man in the Miller Institute, the brilliant surgeon, had collapsed into a sagging mask of flaccid flesh. His left eye rolled upward, his mouth twisted into a permanent, grotesque sneer, while a mixture of saliva and bile leaked uncontrollably from his paralyzed lips. I pushed myself into a seated position, back against the cold wall. Every muscle fiber shrieked in protest. The epinephrine was wearing off, and the massive dose of insulin was silently draining the last of my caloric reserves. An officer stepped forward, brandishing a tactical knife to cut the ropes and lower Julian to the floor. "Stop!" I barked, the sound jagged and dry, tearing through my parched throat. "I am Adeline Miller, chief nurse. That man is suffering from a massive intracerebral hemorrhage. If you move him incorrectly, you will trigger an irreversible spike in intracranial pressure, ICP, and he will suffer a fatal brainstem herniation right here." The officer froze, his gaze a mixture of suspicion and sudden, involuntary respect. I didn't wait for his permission. I began issuing orders with the cold authority of a head nurse on a trauma shift. Maintain his head in a neutral position. Tilt him slightly to the left to prevent aspiration of emesis. Call for a stroke specialty team and a rigid backboard. Do not touch those ropes until forensics has documented the scene. My decisiveness cut through the chaos, imposing a sudden, clinical order on the room. Former colleagues from the Miller Institute entered the suite, stopping dead in their tracks at the sight of their revered chairman bound like a captured beast. while I, the woman they believed to be a bedridden vegetable, commanded the scene with chilling lucidity. A young doctor approached me with a sphygmomanometer and a trauma bag. I extended my skeletal arm, where the faint bruising from the lethal IV line still marked my skin. "Don't waste time on a preliminary workup," I whispered, my eyes locking on to the lead investigator. "I demand an immediate stat blood draw, right here, right now. My vascular system is saturated with high-dose insulin, and there are traces of cyanide from that birthday cake. The half-life of these substances is extremely short. If you don't secure these samples now, you lose the only chemical evidence of his premeditated attempt on my life." I watched as the investigator produced the vacuum tubes and needles. The sting of the needle was sharp, but it brought a profound sense of relief. In medicine, we trust biochemistry more than we trust oaths. That vial of blood was the final, unassailable death warrant for Julian's reputation. As the paramedics began to secure Julian to a spinal board, a forensic officer searched the pockets of his lab coat. He pulled out a small, unlabeled glass vial containing a clear liquid. I caught a glimpse of it, and a fresh jolt of ice ran down my spine. Concentrated potassium chloride, KCl, a substance that, if injected directly into a vein, triggers an immediate cardiac arrest, leaving almost no trace in a standard autopsy. Julian was so monstrously thorough that he trusted no one, not even the suicide script he had written for me. That vial was his ultimate contingency, the insurance policy to finish me if the insulin was too slow, or perhaps to end himself if the walls closed in. He had prepared to kill his wife, his son, his mistress, and eventually himself. His paranoia had transformed him into the most pathetic, solitary figure in the kingdom he so desperately craved. "Mrs. Miller," the lead officer said, his voice softening, "we heard the entire confession through the hospital's PA system. The night shift staff recorded every word. You're safe." I watched the gurney carrying Julian move through the living room. He was shivering, one eye staring vacantly at the ceiling, trapped in the living nightmare of locked-in syndrome. He could hear the sounds of his world crumbling. He could feel the loathing in the room, but he could not move a single muscle to defend himself. I felt no joy in this vengeance, only a hollow, echoing void. What is a human's greatest asset? Wealth? Status? Power? Looking at Sienna's stillness and Julian's somatic prison, I understood that the only true wealth is the clarity of one's mind and a clean conscience. Julian had everything, yet he was the poorest wretch in the city tonight, for he lacked a single soul who could look upon him with genuine grief. I stood up, waving away the wheelchair a medic tried to force upon me. I leaned against the wall, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the window. The blue and red strobes of the police cars below painted the falling snow in hues of blood and ice. The party was over. The predators had been dragged into the light, and I stood alone among the wreckage of a family. But the fear was gone. The hypoglycemic fog had lifted, my liver finally releasing its energy reserves under the command of the epinephrine. I felt weightless, as if for the first time in 50 years, I was breathing with my own lungs, without seeking anyone's permission. This New Year's Eve didn't end with my obituary. It ended with the resurrection of a woman who had been erased. "Take me to the hospital," I told the young doctor. "I need to live. I have a promise to my son that remains unfulfilled." I stepped across the threshold of the living room, never once looking back at the ruins. Dawn was beginning to fracture the horizon, bringing with it a new chapter, a life where I would never again be the victim. A year has bled away since the cataclysmic night at the Miller estate. The January air still carries that distinctive, bone-chilling suburban bite. But the atmosphere is no longer heavy, with the cloying scent of antiseptics and deceit. I stand before Mark's grave in the fading amber of a late afternoon, as the weak winter sun struggles to impart a ghost of warmth to the frozen granite. The wind no longer howls like it did on that New Year's Eve of blood and ice. It merely whispers, gently swaying the pristine white chrysanthemums I've just laid down. Beneath the earth lies my only son, a man taken while his hair was still dark and his heart full. Elsewhere, within the sterile, high-security infirmary of a federal medical prison, Julian is enduring a sentence far more excruciating than a quick death. The hemorrhagic stroke from that night reduced the once imperious board chairman into a stationary mass of biology. He is a prisoner of locked-in syndrome. Total paralysis of nearly all voluntary muscles, except for vertical eye movements. He survives through a peg tube, percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy, his nutrition delivered in a rhythmic, mechanical drip, a perfect, cruel reflection of the chemical cage he locked me in for 2 agonizing years. He is alert, his cognitive functions intact, forced to witness his own decay from within the vault of his skin. Sienna received 20 years for conspiracy and attempted murder. Her youthful luster and calculated elegance are withering behind iron bars, where there are no red silk dresses or vintage champagne flutes. Justice has executed its rounds, as dispassionate and precise as the ticking of a grandfather clock. I look at my own reflection in the polished black stone. I see a 76-year-old woman with hair the color of moonlight, but eyes that burn with a fierce, renewed lucidity. This past year has been a grueling journey of somatic resurrection. To stand on these feet without the crutch of a cane or the shadow of a wheelchair, I have endured physical therapy sessions so agonizing they drew tears from a woman I thought was drained of them. Every dawn, I forced myself through stretches and isometric exercises to reverse the disuse atrophy caused by Julian's daily doses of motor nerve inhibitors. I understand the clinical reality. At my age, bone mineral density has plummeted, and the neuroplasticity of peripheral nerves isn't what it was in my youth. But the human body is more than a sum of biological data. It is an entity that operates under the absolute command of the will. When I forced those first steps, it felt like 1,000 needles piercing my soul's a localized neural firestorm. But I didn't stop. I knew that if I surrendered to the pain, Julian would win a posthumous victory. And I did not let him win. I recovered not through a miracle, but through a meticulous understanding of my own thresholds and a spirit forged in steel. The world suggests that 75 is an age for quiet endings, for fading into the background. But as I stand here, feeling the warm pulse of blood circulating through my veins, I realize a fundamental truth. Old age is not a disease. It is a privilege reserved for those with the fortitude to walk through the fire. Julian's betrayal didn't kill me. It sharpened me into a colder, more resilient blade. My true net worth isn't the deed to the Miller Institute or the vast accounts. It is the absolute, unadulterated freedom of my own mind. Returning from the cemetery, I enter the old villa, a space I have since repurposed. I no longer live among these ghosts, but I have a final duty to perform. I step into Mark's study. The room still holds the scent of old paper and oak, but its silence no longer feels like a vacuum. I sit in my son's swivel chair, my fingers brushing the drawers I hadn't possessed the courage to open for 3 years. In the bottommost compartment, wedged between heavy anatomy and physiology textbooks, I find a pale blue envelope, its edges frayed. My hands tremble not from tremors of the nerves, but from the sudden, sharp premonition of a final secret. Mark's handwriting leaps off the page, bold and definitive. Mom, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. Never believe a word, Father says. I have been secretly diverting samples of the supplements he's been injecting into you for independent lab analysis. I know they aren't vitamins. I've also found evidence that the hydraulic lines on my car have been tampered with. Mom, Father, and Sienna have gone too far. I would rather be the one to go, to draw their fire, to make them complacent enough that they stop watching you so closely. You are the best chief nurse I've ever known. You will know how to save yourself when the time comes. I love you. Tears blur the final lines, soaking into the paper. My poor, brave boy hadn't been a passive victim. He had seen the Reaper's scythe long before the crash. He didn't die by accident. He made a strategic sacrifice to create a window of safety for me. His death was a devastating trade for my life. Julian thought he had removed an obstacle, but he never realized that Mark's sacrifice was the very thing that ignited my survival instinct. I pressed the letter against my chest, feeling my heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. Mark was right. I am a chief nurse, and I saved myself. But more than that, I've learned to live without seeking the pity of the world. Standing at the window, watching the scarlet sunset bleed into the horizon, I realize that true vengeance isn't seeing your enemies die. It's living a life more brilliant and liberated than they could ever conceive. The prescription for my freedom isn't found in any pharmacopoeia. It was compounded from courage, truth, and a son's love. I take a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air of a new beginning. Adeline Miller died on that New Year's Eve, and the woman standing here now is something new, indomitable, and unbroken. I walk out of the room without looking back, leaving the shadows to those who belong to them.